Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus is talking to a crowd of people when someone comes to tell him that his mother, brothers and sisters are outside waiting for him. Jesus replies to the messenger by saying, "Who are my mother and my brothers? Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." When you hear this, it comes as a bit of a jolt, because your initial reaction is that Jesus is saying that his real family, or our real family members, shouldn't mean that much to us. Of course, this is not what Jesus is saying at all. Jesus is saying that true humanity lies in having a common purpose, which is to do God's will. So what is God's will? Well, from my reading of Scripture, it is that creation should grow and exist in harmony. There is nothing that holds or binds people together as in their having a shared understanding and a common way of living, which respects the needs of people and the world. This applies not only to families, to communities, to countries, but also, hopefully, in the end, to all nations. And this is what Jesus is saying in this passage. He's not rejecting his family, rather he's expanding his family by saying that we should acknowledge that we all belong to one family. And just as we care for our own, we should also extend that care to all people. Jesus later will put this into 7 words. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. An understanding that takes us back to the first chapters of Genesis and the stories of the creation of the world. Genesis is an epic, a collection of momentous stories which tell of the beginning of the world and the beginning of a people. The first 2 chapters tell of the creation of the world and give us 2 stories, both actually very different. The first is a kind of prayer, which tells of the world being created in 7 days, and the second is the story of the creation of the first man and woman. Both are stories which are described as myth, but they go further than this, because between them they evoke the wonder and the richness of creation, from formless void to teeming life. But most importantly of all, they offer us the key to understanding ourselves and the world about us, the world in which we live and exist. These stories are shaped and styled into a clear narrative that makes it clear that the origin of the world and of life was no accident, that there is a creator God, that this God's creation was and is beautiful, that human beings were made in God's image, that sin entered human life through moral disobedience, and that the whole human race is caught up in the consequence of this disobedience, but that it is still possible for the world to live together in harmony. So these stories, which appear in the Bible through symbolism and great storytelling, contain some of the most profound truths in the whole of the Bible, and as such deserve to be looked at carefully. Most Christians, most people, believe the story of Adam and Eve to be a myth and not a scientific truth. And actually most scholars believe that the story from its earliest times was never meant to be read as truth. In fact, to read the story as truth is to lose its power completely. However, read it as fiction and its story comes alive, and what a great and timeless story it is. This is the story of Adam, which in Hebrew means man, and of Eve, whom Adam describes so beautifully as bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and who is created equal. Yes, I did say equal. Read the story again if you don't believe me. In the story, Adam is formed from dust by God and from his breath as he breathes life into and over his creation. This is the God who is given in this story a personal name, Yahweh, no longer the God of the first story, the distant deity named El or Elohim. Adam and Eve are naked and they live in a perfect place called Eden. They're given everything they need to live by Yahweh, their creator. The only thing that they must not do is to eat of the fruit of the two trees that stand at the very centre of Eden. The trees which represent life and forbidden knowledge, good and evil, or put very simply, the ability to say yes or no. And we all know what happens. Humankind is tempted into rebellion and paradise is lost. The pain and suffering of the world becomes our fault, caused by our own self-will, our selfishness. God never intended that this should happen. There follows in these early chapters of Genesis the stories of human beings turning from God's purpose. The first murder with Cain and Abel, and from there things just get worse, until in despair God almost destroys his creation with a flood, but not quite, for he recognizes in Noah a man who understands God's purpose, who does love his neighbours as much as he loves himself. So God enters into a covenant, a promise, with his creation as the floodwaters drain away. And God promises never to destroy his creation again, for it is too beautiful to be cast aside forever. Over the millennia, things get no better. God comes to earth to try and show his creation the way to live, and in so doing makes a new promise, a new covenant. God has certainly not finished with his creation. He forgives us, he redeems us through the love of his only Son, Jesus Christ. The only way that we will ever return to Eden, to the world that God created for us, is when we can learn to live together in peace, love, and grace. This is what Jesus was saying when he responded to the message that his family were outside waiting for him by saying to the messenger, "Who are my family? My family are here. Everyone and anyone is my brother, my mother, my sister. This is my family because we are all one family under God." I suppose he could have asked, "How far is Eden? How long before we walk once more in Eden?" Answer, when we learn to be one people under God.